But how different their approach is with their demigod, Anthony Fauci. Although he was never officially charged with the crime, he too had a senior advisor who found himself in major hot water recently. Emails revealed he deleted records and even used back channels to help Dr. Fauci keep evidence secret. But when the good doctor was asked about this, specifically on the efforts to evade FOIA requests and protect this guy named Peter Daszak, who maybe you remember, we already know he received federal grants for his work with the Wuhan lab, Fauci was all denials.
I never spoke about protecting him. I may have mentioned and discussed Dr. Daszak because he's a grantee, but I never spoke about protecting him.
You're testifying that he just made that up.
Excuse me?
You're testifying that Dr. Moran's just made that up.
I don't know where he got that, but that's not true.
Well, of course, Democrats were outraged that Dr. Fauci was asked any questions at all.
Dr. Fauci, we owe you an apology for the way we have rubbed you through the mud, and none of us have said to you, here's where you go to get your good name and your reputation back. We owe you a collective thank you. You are a world-renowned scientist and an American patriot.
Your leadership and service to Republican and Democratic administrations and all Americans saved countless lives and resources. We owe you a debt of gratitude.
A debt? Fauci was the highest paid employee of the federal government for years. Was it 400 and something thousand? And when he left, he received a first-year pension payout exceeding $414,000. That's according to an analysis by Open the Books. Now, the angle, we have to pat ourselves on the back a little bit today because before anyone, we were focused on the Fauci game. Yeah, the game he was playing. This was way back in February of 2020, even before a pandemic was even declared, when Fauci came on the show and he seemed to go out of his way to give the Chinese the benefit of the doubt. Why should we actually believe them when billions, if not trillions of dollars is riding on preserving the idea that all is going to be okay?
Over the last several weeks, the Chinese authorities have really been very explicit that they were going to not tolerate any misinformation going out.
So you're satisfied with all of the transparency coming out of China today about the trajectory of the disease and the origin of the disease?
In my direct interaction with Chinese scientists and Chinese health officials, not party politics people, but medical people and scientists, that I can believe what they're telling me.
It gets funnier every time you hear it, or more infuriated. All right, and now we know that my spidey senses about him, about the entire scamdemic, were accurate. It was far more about pushing the boundaries of manipulation and control than really saving lives. We knew from very early data from Lombardy, Italy, that the COVID virus was simply not a threat to most people. Only those with maybe 2 or 3 comorbidities were at risk of severe complications and death.
There are 2 groups of people who really do poorly with the COVID-19 illness, people who have underlying serious health conditions. A bigger group, not in size, but in the effect, are the elderly, particularly those who live in nursing homes. They often have comorbid illnesses.
And indeed, we learned years later that this was the case. And at the time, we knew it was unwise for the Trump White House to have a lifelong liberal bureaucrat like Fauci lead their response. It was doomed from day one. Not that every mistake was made, but lockdowns, closures were pushed, mandates validated, fake rules advanced that made everyone's life miserable and did irreparable damage to education. But all of this wreckage, all of it to them was collateral damage to a narcissist with a white coat, a man who was used to having little to no oversight over his actions. Now, this is why he thought, I think, that he could get away with this, to keep schools closed.
I think to say every child has to go back to school is not really realizing the fact that we have such a diversity of viral activity. There may be some areas that the level of virus is so high that it would not be prudent to bring the children back to school.
Along with the mask mandate, Fauci's endorsement of social distancing was among the most anti-scientific of his strong recommendations. By the way, a recommendation he's conveniently now trying to distance himself from. Don't blame me. It was the CDC's fault.
Once we realized that the virus was not spread by droplets and was aerosolized, did you feel an indication to go back to the CDC and said, let's base this on science. Let's get rid of this 6-foot rule?
It was a CDC decision, and it was clear.
Were you dialoguing with the CDC?
CDC was part of the coronavirus response team. Yeah.
And you didn't feel an obligation to go to them and say, look, Americans aren't going to trust us. Yeah. We're providing them with misinformation.
We have discussions at the White House about that. We did, but the CDC's decision and was their decision to make, and they made it.
You didn't feel an obligation as the lead scientist at the NIH to challenge that?
I've challenged the CDC multiple times.
Publicly on this regard?
Excuse me?
Publicly you challenged them on the 6-foot distance rule?
It is not appropriate to be publicly challenging a sister organization.
Do you agree?
Wait a second. Not appropriate to challenge the CDC publicly? Really? He had no problem challenging the nation's chief executive officer, his ultimate boss, President Trump.
I was put in a very difficult position that I didn't like, of having to contradict publicly the President of the United States. Well, I felt it was my responsibility, as to preserve my own personal integrity and my major responsibility to the American public to tell them the truth.
Okay, it just gets better and better. Now, the truth is, we gave too much power to a power-hungry bureaucrat with a fancy title and almost entirely abandoned true scientific principles, the Constitution, and common sense. Now, beyond the social distancing farce, the truths that guy abandoned or downplayed. Cloth masks don't work. Viruses attenuate. Natural immunity is real. Mandating experimental shots that don't prevent transmission is unconscionable. Children need to be in school. China can't be trusted. You can't leave the liquor stores open and close the churches, Tony. And finally, we have a First Amendment. Ever heard of it? But even today, you sense that Fauci wishes there was more, not less censorship.
There is so much mis and disinformation around that we've got to do a better job of reaching out and trying to get the correct information. But that's difficult when you have a very energetic group of people continually spreading mis and disinformation.
Inconvenient First Amendment. After all that we have learned about the virus, the true lethality, the alternative and expensive treatments, the harm done to kids, one would think that Tony Fauci would show a little bit of humility, even a little bit, but no. If he had his druthers, I think he'd still have rolling lockdowns.
One of the things that was really a problem with the response was the degree of divisiveness that we had in the country about a lack of a coherent response, where we were having people, for reasons that had nothing to do with public health or science, refusing to adhere to public health intervention measures.
No, they all didn't listen to Tony. They wanted to actually survive. Well, perhaps the best comment on the Fauci reemergence was from Clifton Duncan on X. He wrote, "Your business went under while Fauci went to baseball games. Your mother died alone in a nursing home while Fauci did photo shoots. Your child hanged themselves from despair while Fauci hobnobbed with celebs. People got divorced. People severed lifelong friendships. People lost decades-long careers. People were trapped with abusers. People overdosed and killed themselves. People lost out on proms and graduations. People lost loved ones that could have been saved. People are injured by a shot they didn't want, all because we decided to trust the science, that, of course, being Anthony Fauci, according to Anthony Fauci. We can never, and I mean never, let happen to this country again what happened under him. We're going to be paying for the Fauci effect for a generation, perhaps more. His imperiousness on the Hill today is simply further evidence that he was the wrong man at the wrong time to help formulate a common sense plan to deal with the Wuhan flu. And that's the angle. All right, joining me now is Congressman Brad Wenstrup, chair of the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, and Dr. Peter McCullough, internist and cardiologist. Congressman, let's start with you. What do you think the most important fact is that you've uncovered in all of your investigations?
Well, I think that the numerous facts that we have uncovered have led to the very notion that Dr. Fauci, as director of the NIAID, takes no responsibility for anything that seemed to happen when it comes to the grant process, when it comes to the nefarious behavior within his agency. The lack of control that exists within his agency tells us everything. But more so, I'd say the messaging was absolutely horrible, and so was bedside manner through this entire process. We've seen so many incidents of things that he said that make no sense. And you look at us as a nation having a mandate for the vaccine when we have people coming across the border that are unvaccinated, untested, and then dispersed around the country. That's not science. And by the way, we were funding gain-of-function research in China.
Well, that's the most important fact. Yeah, I asked you what the most important fact was, not to be a brat here, but what is the most important fact we learned? Dr. McCullough, the number one fact that we learned about Anthony Fauci.
You know, we learned that he was overseeing and coordinating a U.S.-Chinese conspiracy to create SARS-CoV-2. Ralph Baric, Peter Daszak, Anthony Fauci, Dr. Xingling Li in Wuhan, China. They co-conspired, and Baric published in 2015, 2016, the creation of a SARS-like Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 virus that was poised for human emergence. And Fauci is on Capitol Hill, despite the best efforts of Dr. Wenstrup and others, deceiving America and deceiving the world.
Well, Congressman, that's quite a charge. I would tend to agree with what Dr. McCullough just said there. The United States of America, perhaps, there's an argument to be made, a fairly strong argument, that was indirectly funding the research that ended up causing this lab leak. Do you think the truth is headed to that? The evidence is headed to that, Congressman?
I think so, and I'm a little taken back by the comment that was just made because our work has been very thorough, and we have been building the pyramid leading up to Dr. Fauci, and we have been looking at what was going on in Wuhan, China. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. I started looking at this from the get-go in February of 2020. As the physician on the Intelligence Committee, I would tell you, if you start looking into this, I found out that there was a virus, a chimera, created by Ralph Baric in North Carolina and Zhengli Shi in China. So the efforts have been going on to what's happened there. You know, Dr. Fauci said it came from nature, but behind the scenes, he and the people that wrote Proximal Origins were saying this looks engineered and could have come from the lab. We have been pointing in that direction in every occasion, but guess what? We are probably never going to get the definitive answer unless somebody speaks up in China, and if they do, they probably won't survive very long.
Well, Fauci denied a lot of things, but at least he admitted one. Watch.
Mask mandates for children under 5, there's scientific evidence supporting that?
There was no study that did masks on kids before. You couldn't do the study. You had to respond to an epidemic that was killing 4,000 to 5,000 Americans.
Dr. McCullough, you and I talked about the masks, I think in March of 2020. They had already done the influenza study that was on the CDC's own website that showed that cloth masks didn't work. So then he's like, oh, well, we didn't have a study. They didn't have a study for social distancing. Congressman Wenstrup has exposed all of this.
It's true. Masks never work. They should never have been a primary intervention. The focus always should have been on early treatment to prevent hospitalizations and deaths. It was a giant distraction focusing on contagion control. Laura, everyone in the country got COVID-19. The whole purpose of a mask would be to avoid getting it. We all got it. We should have been focusing on early treatment.
Chairman, very quickly, are you concerned that if Joe Biden were reelected, heaven forbid, and we had another dangerous outbreak of some type of disease, that we'd be back at square one here with the mentality that we saw at the NIH?
Unless we're able to put in place the recommendations and suggestions and legal authorities that we're going to want to put in when we finish our report, then we will be in big trouble, like you just said.
Chairman, Dr. McCullough, thank you both.